If part 1 felt uncomfortably accurate, it's because we hadn't reached the lie yet. Today, we do. There's a sentence you rely on more than you realize. Not out loud. Internally. I'll deal with it later. It sounds harmless. Responsible, even. Later implies intention. It implies maturity. It implies control. But later isn't a plan. It's a psychological buffer. It creates distance between you and discomfort. Between you and responsibility. Between you and the moment where a decision would force change. Later feels safe because it has no edge. No deadline. No demand. As long as something is scheduled for later, it doesn't need to be faced now. It doesn't need clarity. It doesn't need courage. It just needs time. And time feels infinite when you're avoiding something uncomfortable. This is where the illusion takes hold. You tell yourself you're not avoiding. You're sequencing. You're being patient. Practical. Realistic. But notice what never actually happens. Later never arrives. It just shifts. When this week ends, it becomes next month. When this phase passes, it becomes the next season. When things settle down, it becomes after the next obligation. Later adapts. It follows you. Because later isn't tied to a condition. It's tied to a feeling. And that feeling is, not yet ready. The problem is, readiness doesn't come from waiting. It comes from deciding. And deciding would mean admitting something uncomfortable. That the way things are currently handled can't continue indefinitely. That stability isn't the same as sustainability. That functioning isn't the same as being okay. So, later becomes a way to preserve the present without questioning it. You keep everything exactly as it is, while telling yourself change is coming. That's the illusion. And illusions are powerful. They let you feel responsible without acting. They let you feel hopeful without moving. They let you believe you're in control while nothing actually changes. This is why later feels so attractive. It protects your identity. As long as the decision hasn't been made, you don't have to confront what that decision might reveal. About your limits. About your priorities. About what you've been tolerating for longer than you want to admit. Later keeps those questions quiet. But your body doesn't live in later. Your nervous system lives in now. It lives with the open loops. The unresolved pressure. The background tension you've learned to ignore. Every postponed decision stays active in your system. Not consciously. Physiologically. Your body keeps preparing for a moment that never arrives. That's why the tension doesn't fade. It accumulates. Later doesn't reduce stress. It stores it. And storage has limits. Eventually, the system pushes back. Through restlessness. Through irritability. Through that familiar drop in your stomach when the alert appears. Not because the alert is new. But because the margin that later depended on is running out. Later only works when there's excess. Excess time. Excess energy. Excess belief that you'll handle it before it matters. When that excess disappears, the illusion cracks. And that's when later stops sounding responsible and starts sounding like what it really is. Avoidance. Not because the words changed. Because reality did. This is the moment most people misinterpret. They think the problem is urgency. Pressure. Bad timing. But the real problem is that later has been doing a job it was never meant to do. It was never meant to hold your peace together. It was never meant to carry your sense of safety. It was never meant to substitute for clarity. And once you see that, something becomes impossible to ignore. Every time you say later, you're not postponing a decision. You're actively choosing to keep things exactly as they are. That choice has been running in the background this whole time. And it's about to stop being silent. Because the next step isn't about when you decide. It's about whether you're willing to admit that later has already been deciding for you. That's where we go next. There's a moment when thinking stops being in charge. You don't choose it. You don't plan it. It just happens. Your body reacts before your thoughts organize. Before you analyze. Before you rationalize. Before you tell yourself it's fine. That's not weakness. That's hierarchy. Because your nervous system doesn't care about explanations. It cares about safety. And for a while, avoidance convinced it that things were manageable. Unclear, but manageable. Unresolved, but survivable. Until it wasn't. This is the shift most people miss. They think anxiety shows up when things get worse. But most of the time, anxiety shows up when pretending stops working. When your body realizes that the strategy you've been using doesn't actually reduce risk anymore. It just delays it. That's when it steps in. Not to scare you. To override you. That's why the reaction feels sudden. The tight chest. The shallow breath. The stomach drop that happens before the number even registers. Your body isn't reacting to the alert. It's reacting to the weight you've been carrying without resolution. Months of open loops. Weeks of postponed decisions. Years of telling yourself you'll handle it later. Your body tolerated that for a long time. But tolerance isn't infinite. And when your nervous system senses that delay is no longer keeping you safe, it stops negotiating. It signals. Clearly. This matters, your body isn't panicking because it's irrational. It's reacting because it's precise. It tracks patterns your mind keeps smoothing over. It notices that clarity keeps getting postponed. That your margin keeps shrinking. That decisions keep getting deferred without anything replacing them. So it does exactly what it's designed to do. It raises the alarm. Not because something exploded. But because something should have been addressed by now. This is where people turn against themselves. They think, I need to calm down. I need to manage my anxiety. I'm overreacting. But the reaction isn't the problem. It's the message. Your body is telling you something your mind has been postponing. That the cost of waiting crossed a line. That the risk of not deciding now feels greater than the risk of deciding wrong. That avoidance stopped regulating you and started destabilizing you. This is why logic doesn't work in these moments. You can tell yourself the numbers aren't that bad. That you've handled worse. That nothing terrible is happening right now. And your body doesn't care. Because logic evaluates outcomes. Your body tracks direction. And the direction you've been moving in hasn't felt safe for a while. That's the confrontation. Not with the numbers. With the pattern. Your body is saying, this way of operating doesn't work anymore. And once the body takes over, something changes. You lose the ability to pretend neutrality. You can still avoid. But it won't feel calm. You can still delay. But it won't feel protective. Because now, every postponed decision carries a physical cost. Tension. Restlessness. That constant sense of being slightly on edge. This is the point where many people try to numb. They scroll. They distract. They stay busy. Anything to quiet the signal. But signals that get ignored don't disappear. They escalate. Not dramatically. Persistently. Your body will keep reminding you that something needs to change. Not because it wants certainty. Because it wants alignment. And this is where the conflict sharpens. You can try to get comfort back by avoiding more. Or you can accept that comfort is no longer available through delay. That's the fork. And whether you acknowledge it or not, your body already knows which direction leads out of this. The question is whether your mind is willing to catch up. Because the next step isn't about calming yourself down. It's about deciding what kind of signal you're willing to live with. That's where we go next. If this were just about numbers, you would have dealt with it already. You're capable. You're intelligent. You know how to learn. The reason this has stayed unresolved for so long isn't confusion. It's resistance. Not to action, but to what action would force you to admit. Because a real decision doesn't just change your bank balance. It changes the story you've been telling yourself. About who you are. About how responsible you've been. About how temporary this situation really is. This is the part most people avoid naming. You're not afraid of choosing the wrong option. You're afraid of what a clear choice would say about your past choices. Clarity has consequences. Once you see things clearly, you can't claim ignorance anymore. You can't hide behind, "I didn't know." You can't tell yourself this just happened. You can't pretend it's all circumstantial. Clarity forces ownership. And ownership threatens identity. Because if you decide honestly, one of two things becomes true. Either you admit that what you've been doing hasn't been enough. Or you admit that what you've been tolerating has been too much. Both require letting go of a version of yourself that felt safer. The one who was handling it. The one who was almost there. The one who just needed a little more time. That version protected your self-respect. Letting it go feels like failure. Even when it isn't. This is why the mind fights clarity so hard. Not because clarity is painful, but because clarity collapses excuses. And excuses aren't laziness. They're insulation. They protect you from shame. From regret. From the quiet question of whether you should have acted sooner. So instead of deciding, you hover. You stay informed, but not committed. Aware, but not aligned. Concerned, but not decisive. It feels like responsibility. But it's actually self-preservation. At a cost. Because while you're protecting your identity, your nervous system keeps absorbing the tension. It carries the weight your mind refuses to place anywhere. This is where the conflict tightens. You can feel that something has to change. But you can also feel that changing would force a reckoning. With habits. With standards. With choices you justified because they felt necessary at the time. That reckoning is what you've been avoiding. Not the spreadsheet. Not the balance. The moment where you'd have to say, quietly and honestly, "This way of living doesn't work for me anymore." That sentence sounds simple. It isn't. Because once you say it, you can't keep living the same way without feeling the dissonance. That's why clarity feels dangerous. It removes the ability to drift. And drifting has been how you survived. But survival mode has an expiration date. And your body already knows it's approaching. This is the core blockage. Not fear of loss. Fear of transition. Fear of stepping into a version of yourself that no longer gets to avoid. That no longer gets to say later. That no longer gets to stay vague. That version would have to choose. Not perfectly. But intentionally. And intention is heavier than avoidance. But it's also stabilizing. This is the moment the path splits for real. One direction lets you keep your old identity, at the cost of ongoing tension. The other asks you to loosen your grip on who you've been, to regain trust in yourself. That choice is coming whether you invite it or not. Because once you see the block clearly, you can't keep pretending it's just about money. And that's what we face next. Not what you should do, but what happens after you decide to stop protecting the old version of yourself. That's where things actually change. There's a strange moment that comes after you see the block clearly. Not relief. Not motivation. Space. A quiet, unfamiliar pause. The pressure doesn't disappear, but it shifts. It's no longer sharp. It's heavy. Because now you're not fighting the truth anymore. You're sitting with it. This is the part no one talks about. After you stop defending the old version of yourself, there's a gap. You haven't decided yet. You haven't acted yet. But you also can't pretend you don't know. That gap feels unsettling. Not because something bad is happening, but because something familiar is gone. The internal arguments quiet down. The excuses don't land the same way. The mental noise drops just enough for you to notice what's underneath. And what's underneath isn't panic. It's responsibility. Not the loud, external kind. The internal kind. The kind that doesn't shout. It waits. This is why this phase feels uncomfortable in a different way. There's less drama. Less urgency. But more weight. Because now, every option feels real. Before, you could postpone without consequence. Now, postponement feels like a choice. Before, you could distract yourself. Now, distraction feels thin. You notice it when you reach for your phone and nothing changes. When you stay busy and attention doesn't fade. When later crosses your mind and doesn't bring relief. That's not anxiety increasing. That's avoidance losing its anesthetic effect. You've removed the padding. And without padding, the truth presses closer. This is the space where many people rush. They want to fill it quickly. With plans. With goals. With rules. Anything to avoid staying here. But rushing here usually recreates the same pattern. Action without alignment. Movement without clarity. Another version of doing something to avoid deciding. This space isn't asking for speed. It's asking for honesty. Because the moment you stop defending yourself, a quieter question starts forming. Not, what should I do? But, what am I no longer willing to live with? That question doesn't need an immediate answer. But it does need to be faced. This is where things start to turn. Not because you've chosen yet, but because you've stopped lying to yourself about what the choice costs. You can feel the edge now. Not as panic. As gravity. The sense that staying the same will take more effort than changing. That awareness is new. And once it's there, it doesn't go away. You don't need courage yet. You don't need a plan yet. You just need to notice what no longer feels sustainable. That's the signal this phase brings. Because the decision that's coming next won't be made out of fear. It will be made out of weight. And weight is harder to ignore. That's where we go next. There's a moment when neutrality disappears. Not because you chose something, but because time chose for you. Up until now, it felt possible to stay in the middle. To wait. To hold things open. But at some point, not deciding stops being passive. It becomes directional. Every day you don't choose, the current setup keeps running. The same habits. The same pressures. The same background tension. Nothing changes. And that is the change. This is the part most people misunderstand. They think decisions only happen when you act. When you sign. When you commit. But decisions also happen when you allow the default to continue. When you let the same system repeat itself, you're voting for it. Quietly. Automatically. Without ever saying yes. That's what makes this uncomfortable. Because once you see it, you can't claim neutrality anymore. Staying vague isn't neutral. Waiting isn't neutral. Later isn't neutral. They all point in a direction. And that direction has been shaping your days, your energy, your sleep, your attention. You didn't choose it deliberately. But it's been chosen nonetheless. This is why the tension feels heavier now. Before, avoidance felt like rest. Now it feels like consent. Consent to more of the same. More background stress. More mental clutter. More nights where your mind keeps circling the same questions. This isn't about blaming yourself. It's about accuracy. Because the moment you realize that an action is active, something shifts inside. You stop asking, what should I do? And start noticing, what am I already choosing by not deciding? That question lands differently. It removes the illusion of safety. It removes the idea that waiting is harmless. And it introduces a quieter pressure. Responsibility without drama. The kind that doesn't rush you, but doesn't let you drift either. This is the edge. Where continuing as you are starts to feel heavier than stepping into the unknown. Not because the unknown is suddenly safe, but because the familiar has become unsustainable. You can feel it in your body. The way postponement no longer soothes. The way distraction doesn't land. The way, I'll deal with it later, feels hollow instead of protective. That's not panic. That's clarity beginning to take shape. And clarity doesn't shout. It narrows. It reduces the options. It removes excuses. It leaves you with fewer places to hide. Not yet with a plan. Not yet with an answer. But with a truth that's hard to ignore: if you do nothing, you are choosing something. And once that's clear, the question stops being whether you'll decide. It becomes when, and what you're willing to keep paying until you do. That's where we go next. Because the next step isn't about action yet. It's about the internal commitment that makes real action possible. Now you can see the trap. Not emotionally, structurally. And once you see it, postponing doesn't feel neutral anymore. Stopping here would be another version of later. The final video is where the line actually gets crossed. We won't talk about tactics or plans. We'll cross the internal line that makes real change unavoidable. Watch it now in the playlist.